Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 23 of the Convo podcast, entitled Hijacking a Generation, 20 Years of the War on Terror. Inshallah, in this episode, we will be looking at we'll be looking back at the last 20 years of this phenomenon called the War on Terror, on its implications, and specifically focusing on the implications that it's had on the mindset of your average Muslim, yourself and myself. We have with us a couple of highly esteemed, honorable guests that we are very, very happy to have with us tonight. Inshallah, if my co-host can introduce them.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. And I certainly do have the pleasure of introducing our guests today. So we've got with us Dr. Asim Qureshi, who is the Research Director of Advocacy Group 𝒂𝒓𝒔, who do some very, very commendable work, mashallah. He's specialized in investigating the impact of counterterrorism practices worldwide since 2003. He has authored a range of reports, academic journals and articles. He's also the author of the book Rules of the Game, Detention, Deportation and Disappearance, as well as the more recent publication, if I'm not mistaken, A Virtue of Disobedience. So thank you very much, Dr. Asim. We've also got with us Brother Zulfikar Muhammad Sharif. He's a writer on Islam, politics and international relations. He's also a Singaporean political activist who was jailed without trial for 4.5 years in solitary confinement to boot. He was accused of supporting terrorism by the Singaporean government, and he was only recently released in November of last year. So thank you very much for joining us. And lastly, we have Brother Kamran Khalid, who is a lawyer, a sessional academic and executive member of the Muslim Legal Network. He is based in Sydney, and his thesis is on Pakistan's counterterrorism framework. He also has other research areas, including Islamic law in the Muslim world, South Asian politics and post-colonial thought. So that was a lot to rattle off for our guests, but Jazakallah khair. Thank you very, very much to all of you for joining us. And I think I can speak for our audience as well as us as a host. We're very, very excited for this discussion to be happening. It's a very timely discussion, obviously coming soon after the 20-year mark of the September 11 issue, and then obviously the war on terror that immediately followed after. But I guess we can start with just asking for some of your broad thoughts, or what would you say if someone was to ask you about the war on terror, broadly speaking? Now, obviously, there is very much that can be said, and in this discussion, we will narrow it down. But if you were to sort of give a nutshell reading of the war on terror and how you've come to experience it and how it's impacted you, what would be your take on that? Asim, perhaps you can start with yourself.
I mean, to put it very simply, I think it was a very deliberate targeting of Muslims in a variety of kind of domestic and international contexts. Muslims being portrayed as seditious, as treacherous, as potential threats to whatever society that they lived in and towards an international order. So I think if you wanted to summarize it, because as you said, we could just go on about this for a very, very long time, because, I've represented people from, kind of places from like Guantanamo Bay in Iraq, Afghanistan, across the Balkans in Africa. So we could talk about the various elements of it almost endlessly. But if you wanted to synthesize that, then of course, I would say it's a targeting of Muslims as potential suspects.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. Brother Zulfikar, you had obviously, as we alluded to in our introduction, you've had a very specific personal experience brought about by this war on terror and the narrative that it puts forward. Perhaps you could, alongside your broad thoughts on it, give us a bit of background on that as well.
Assalamu alaikum. I think in relation to the first point about the effect of the war on terror, I'd just like to take it back. Regardless of who was responsible, let's assume that whatever has been said about the war on terror and the narrative that was created was true. Now, my position is that every society has a right to defend itself. Every society has a right to feel secure. And that applies not just to Muslims, it applies to the United States, it applies to Australia, and every society has that right to defend itself. The question is, how do you create that sense of security for yourself? Do you create that sense of security by perpetuating violence and prolonging violence, or do you get that sense of security and safety by trying to create a more understanding relationship with the others that you may think that may represent a threat to you? So if, let's say, whatever was said about September 11th was true, the action that came out of that did not help to create more safety or more security for the United States or anyone else. So that whole premise falls because it creates more violence and it creates more difficulties for everyone. Now, on my personal part, what I also see is this: we have been defeated in terms of the language of our society and our beliefs. What I noticed earlier was that even when we speak about Islam, it becomes a speech that is problematized. So when you talk about Sharia, it becomes as if you're trying to impose it on others. It becomes something that is violent. It becomes something that seeks destruction. Even when you talk about things that are good within Islam, it becomes the narrative that was created was that. So in 2014, I was against the Bashar al-Assad government because it was a murderous tyrant. This was what the Bashar government was. So I was against that. And when this crazy group ISIS came on, at that time I thought that they were just trying to fight and trying to get rid of this dictator. So I thought, yeah, that was good. When I realized that they were doing crazy things, I said that no, this is wrong, and I criticized them. But that, because I was also a political activist in Singapore, and there was no real justification for the Singapore government to take action against me. But that little bit of point where I criticized Bashar and then I said that, all these things that was going on, that became a justification for authoritarian regimes to use against the Muslims. And it became something that is not just valuable, but something that they can use. So they start to create this narrative that those who speak against the system that exists becomes a threat to society, so they can be accused of being terrorists. So on the personal level, that's it, that all these things are used to justify action against Muslims. And at the same time, we as a society, we have lost a Muslim society, we have lost the sense, the narrative. We cannot even talk about Islam as if it's something good.
Yeah.
Brother Kamran, if you want to just have some opening words on your thoughts generally on the matter.
Sorry, and I'll chime in there as well. Brother Kamran, you were at the commencement of the war on terror, you were in Pakistan, right?
That's right.
So maybe you can give us, especially because Afghanistan being right next door and sort of the immediate action towards Afghanistan by the Americans, maybe you can give us a bit of that take as well.
Yeah, sure. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and 𝒔𝒊𝒎 𝒂𝒓 for giving me the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. I'll let you know my thoughts about the global framework and then shift my words towards what happened in Pakistan. There seems to be if I was to describe the war on terror in my own terms, I would say that there is a concern about secrecy in general. The secrecy with which especially power was accumulated behind shadows in the hands of what we can call the deep state, the military generals, the contractors, the intelligence agencies. And it kind of started right after 9/11. It started in the US. We saw the same in our Muslim world as well. I mean, if you talk about the US, within a week after the 9/11, the Congress delegated the authority to go to war to President Bush, which was a very unique decision, the authorization for the use of military force. Only one lawmaker, a Congresswoman, Barbara Lee, voted against that, and she had to face death threats and whatnot, and a lot of backlash. On the back of that, then dozens of other orders were signed in the coming years by the White House officials and the U.S. administration itself, giving more power to CIA, giving more power to U.S. military, the special operations, the Joint Special Operations Command and whatnot. Basically, to all those people who remain out of the public eye, who are not answerable to the parliament or directly accountable to the public, who can't be scrutinized by the media and so on and so forth. And the same we saw in the Muslim world. If you talk about Pakistan already had an issue pretty much since inception with the deep state. The deep state pretty much controls most of the political affairs of the country, even to this day. And that only got worse after 9/11. Personally, I was in the early years of my high school, so I was too young to be politically aware at the time of the Afghan war in 2001. But I remember the community response, the fear, the anxiety which was there in the public. We were told that the U.S. had won Pakistan. Richard Holbrooke, who was the Deputy Secretary of State at that time, he had told a Pakistani ISI chief that be ready to be born back to the Stone Age if you don't help us.
Yes, I remember.
So
that quote,
you have to be with us. If you're not with us, then be ready to face this kind of wrath. So there was that sort of fear among the community, which was partly perpetuated by our own leaders as well, that U.S. Is going to strike us if we don't agree to whatever they say and take part in this war on terror. And it's not going to be the U.S., it's going to be the U.S. and India, which will form an alliance and strike. We were told that, India has already agreed to give bases in Amritsar and, whatnot. And so Musharraf used the famous phrase of wounded bear, right? So the U.S. is acting like a wounded bear, and it can, strike anyone. So it's good for us. It's in the national interest. The catchphrase, which is used so many times in the counterterrorism, that we have to just go on with the war on terror and do what the U.S. says. So obviously, once Pakistan sided with the U.S., there was a bit of a sense of relief. There was also aid coming in. The media was liberalized, and there was this period of what Musharraf called the enlightened moderation, where Islam was sort of liberalized, Western culture was promoted, and through media and whatnot. So everyone was kind of like, in the initial years, people were like in the prosperity high, so as to speak. Little did we know, and as things started to emerge later, that people were getting picked up. The agencies were picking up people and shipping them off to Guantanamo Bay. People in Balochistan, in Fatah, Pashtuns and the Baloch, people who live on the peripheries, they were getting extrajudicially killed. Mm-hmm. Drone attacks had started in the country and whatnot. So all of these details started to emerge later, just because there was too much power which was in the hands of people who were just not open to the public, not answerable to anyone.
Those thoughts. Hamza, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. You were about to say something.
Yeah. So, look, I just wanted to sort of following on from that, and Kamran, you've given us a good sort of move into what we wanted to look at further, which was that, so September 11 happens, and almost instantaneously there's declarations of war. The US is now going to head into Afghanistan. And Muslims the world over now have to deal with this reality that, okay, there's going to be boots on the ground in the Muslim world. And it's not as though that reality is new to Muslims, unfortunately, but this was sort of a new phase, right? It was this renewed push. And I just want to ask, how did communities respond to that? Now, I remember when it happened, I was still quite young, primary school, so it didn't really click to me, but I do remember feeling that there was an agitation and anxiety on the streets with Muslims. Just stay on the down low. Things aren't great for us at the moment. We need to sort of be in the background. Even though sentimentally they weren't happy. Muslims were not happy that this is happening. Asim, you were obviously in the UK at that time, I assume. What was the feeling there when there was now a global war effort, especially with the whole you're either with us or against us, coalition of the willing, all that being thrown onto Muslims? What was the feeling?
Yeah, Yeah, I think that people generally were feeling quite anxious about what had happened. I think a lot of people could see that there was going to be some kind of backlash to an incident like this. And it was interesting, of course, right? Because, this wasn't, in the Muslim imagination, there were so many other tragedies that were going on, around the Muslim world in even the decade prior to this. And so it's not like we weren't used to seeing tragedies taking place and, kind of innocent lives being lost. This was part of the, part of the vernacular of the unfortunate geopolitics that were going on in the world. And so this felt like a slightly different moment, kind of felt like in some ways, immediately Islam was under attack. There were so many opinion editorials coming out. For those of us who were a little bit older, maybe we were reading this stuff. We could see that there was intensification of hostility towards Muslims in Islam. Many of us were familiar already with kind of Orientalist tropes about Muslims, but this was kind of largely subsumed within a general racist kind of vernacular that especially kind of Europeans and Americans had towards any person of color. It wasn't just us, right? Like, there was just kind of pervasive racism that was taking place. 9/11 puts a focus on us. Like it's almost like a magnification of who we are. But now we're being viewed. Now we're finally being seen. Up until this point, Muslims were largely living very, very neoliberal lives, right? They were kind of socially conservative, but very much embedded in kind of structures of capitalism. They wanted a very Western lifestyle, but a halal version of it, effectively. So whatever it was that was going on, they would just embed themselves in society. So they weren't prepared in many ways for the force of the reaction that would take place. Now, younger people in university, especially people like myself, we became very much aware and conscious of, in an increasing way. I mean, there are many of us who had lived through Bosnia. We understood what was going on there. We were familiar with what was going on, but there was an intensification for us because of 9/11. But our parents' generation, many of them were a bit more reticent. Alhamdulillah, not my own parents, who were very supportive of my change of career, or at least pathway towards trying to help Muslims. But, I came across many, 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 many parents who were extremely troubled and would encourage their children not to stand out in any way, whether it was in the way that they superficially looked by keeping beards or wearing hijab or expressing their politics within university spaces or school spaces. So there was almost like the self-censoring taking place. This is where that trauma really begins. The idea that somehow you could invisibilize yourself in terms of the perception that you are a threat, that somehow as an individual you could overcome the widespread hostility that existed. And of course, this was kind of self-cannibalistic, because ultimately by not organizing, by not presenting a strong face, by apologizing, what we were doing is constantly reaffirming everything that they already believed about us. And so unfortunately, the response to 9/11 from Muslim communities around the world, was woeful at best. And in some ways it's understandable, because people went to the self-preservation mode, but it didn't make it right. And it had a very negative impact on the long-term well-being of our communities. And so the world in which a younger generation, a generation like yours, grew up in, when it became conscious, it never knew a pre-9/11 world as such. It was only ever we are facing a constant hostility in the media by politicians, by the police, by kind of, even kind of capitalist industries through their surveillance, kind of surveillance capitalism. Like almost it's ubiquitous in every single sector of society. That generation, the 9/11 generation, the ones who were maybe like below the age of 10 when it took place, they grew up in a world where they never even saw what life was like before, or never understood what life was like before that. When they came into understanding, it's like, well, we're a threat. That's how we're perceived. So I think that it's particularly troubling for them.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point to mention. That's why we've chosen to title this podcast "Hijacking a Generation," because it's an entire generation that's been brought up and grown into and lived and experienced nothing but a war on terror, where their identities have been not just under the microscope, but in the crosshairs. And that's going to have serious implications. And that's why we wanted to look at the mindset. And speaking of mindsets, I'll direct this to Brother Zulfikar. So Asim was described about, in fact, mentioned that our response was somewhat woeful. Like, it was just sort of a bit all over the place, a bit defensive, and it wasn't really a strong, united kind of thing. But in the face of this onslaught, what could we say about the concept of our global ummah, about sort of the unity of Muslims? Did perhaps this antagonism stoke that a little, or, was that sort of something that was on people's minds? What can we say about that?
I would just like to add on to what Asim said earlier. I was 30 when September 11th happened, so I wasn't young. So I remember the world how it was prior to September 11th. But what I see as one of the biggest effects of September 11th and the war on terror in relation to our community is that we are internalizing this sense of defeatedness. So we are weak, and we see ourselves as being weak. And because of that, there's nothing else that we can do apart from complying with what someone else wants us to do. So I think that is one of the biggest problems that we have. And I'm not talking about being weak militarily or economically. I'm talking about ideationally. We are defeated ideationally. We do not see that there are other ways for us to engage. We do not see that that we can pursue our interests. We do not see that we can argue and we can lobby, we can campaign, we can make changes. We do not see that we have the agency, we have the ability and the strength to change this world, to make it a better place as how we as Muslims understand it to be. If we see ourselves as a Khairul Ummah, that we are the best of nations, we've got something to bring to this world, and that we can bring this beauty, this wonderful thing that we know as Islam. And yet we see that, we are under attack. There's all this power against us. There's nothing that we can do. So we just accept whatever that they tell us to do. So for example, in Singapore, I'm an Australian citizen too, and in Singapore, right soon after the September 11th, the Singapore government arrested this group of people, claim that they are terrorists. They've been detained for almost 20 years now. Not
still detained.
Yeah, there's still a number of them still in detention without trial. I do not know whether they were involved in violence or not. The thing is that we do not know. Right? So there's no question. And the thing that I find to be very interesting is that the Muslim community leaders has refused to even engage on this issue. So what I also see is that there is now this greater sense of disengagement between the community leaders and the ground. That the ground, we are trying to move a bit more. That we want to be heard. We want to make changes. We see all these problems and we want to be united again. But the Muslim leaders, they feel that they are being strategic. So they work with the government. They try to please the powers and the authorities. And because of that, there's that break between the Muslim community leaders and the Muslim ground. That's what I see. So for example, in Singapore, soon after the arrest, the secret police worked with a group of shuyukh, and they created this group called the RRG, the Religious Rehabilitation Group, whose job is to rehabilitate the claimed terrorists. But at the same time, this RRG defines the way that Muslims are supposed to behave in relation to the state, in relation to what the Sharia is, in relation to concepts of the global Ummah. So now we are told that, there's no such thing, that we are supposed to give our our allegiance only to the government of the day. And the government has been around for 60 years. It's the same one-party government. So we are supposed to give our allegiance to them. So what we have is that this group of Muslim leaders who now work closely with the government, and they are telling us how we are supposed to behave in relation to what the government wants.
And Brother 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒓, sorry to interrupt, but that's, you live in Australia, you live in Melbourne yourself. That's essentially been the model that's been applied everywhere around the world. It starts on a question of law, and it just scope creeps into a question of values and beliefs, and
like in the UK and in Australia, we had that question of, are you British or Muslim? Are you Australian? Are you Muslim? But I guess this can lead us to Brother Kamran. You've got an interest specifically in the Pakistani government's anti-terror response. Now, most of us were sitting in the Western world experiencing that reality of, are you British, Muslim, Australian, Muslim, whatever else. What was the local kind of policy from the Pakistani government, especially considering that, in the Muslim world with the war in Afghanistan happening right next door, what policy was being adopted there in this sort of counter-terrorism world?
Yeah, look, I think on a community level, there was very little information, first of all, which was being shared, right? Most of the information which was being shared was mostly through fear and anxiety that the US is, as I said before, is acting like a wounded bear, and it's just going to eat us all up. So we just have to give in. We just have to listen to their demands. We heard of some of a document having 7 demands which were shared with the leadership by the US, and we should have said yes to basically all of them, which included things like access to bases and things like that. But what we found out in the years coming later is that the parameters of the Pakistan's assistance to the US were pretty broader than even those original 7 demands. So things like drone attacks, things like secretly picking people up and making them then disappear in the middle of the night, either shipping them to putting them on a plane to Cuba or just putting them in Bagram in Afghanistan or somewhere else. We didn't know that was happening. We didn't know that the drone attacks were happening. We didn't know that the American troops were already starting to begin ground raids in the northwestern part of Pakistan. So all of this was kept hidden from the public eye and purpose and deliberately so, because obviously Pakistan has a history of on a political level, it had a history of alliance with the Taliban the regime, but on the societal level, obviously, because more than 95% of people are Muslims, then there was going to be a strong anger of what was happening next door. And especially when Iraq invasion happened, at the time of Afghanistan, people were really scared. But when Iraq invasion happened, people sort of started to see through this agenda of targeting Muslims worldwide, not just in Afghanistan. And at that time, people were more, I suppose, angrier than quiet. And that's why initially the government had decided to send some troops as part of coalition in Iraq, but then decided against that because the public sentiment at that time was that this war is just senselessly spreading over the Muslim world. In terms of the political leadership of the Muslim world, people in Pakistan were generally disappointed, or I would say they didn't expect much from them anyway. They were called from religious circles, obviously, to unify and to fight the American the American devil and whatnot, but no one really saw any unity coming. The leaders of Muslim Ummah were bending over backwards not to be on the wrong side of the US. There were only 3 countries at that time who were recognizing the Taliban government: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, and all 3 of them sided with the US in this project. The CIA outsourced a lot of snatching and grabbing of Al-Qaeda suspects and other terrorist suspects to Muslim countries. So countries like Jordan, Egypt Pakistan, even Libya initially, their secret service agencies were, picking people up and interrogating on behalf of CIA. 1 month before the U.S. invasion, we later found out that the Crown Prince of Dubai gave an airstrip near Kandahar, which he had kept for hunting purposes, to the U.S. The Consul General in Dubai, and say, it's yours, do whatever you want to do. And then we found out later that U.S. troops came by boat, and they were shipped in the middle of the night through Pakistan into into an airbase, and then flown from there over to this secret airbase in Kandahar around November, when after the initial airstrikes led into the ground war in Afghanistan. So there was a lot of secrecy, and the idea was just like, you just have to give in, and part of that, I would say, had also to do with our leadership seeking international legitimacy. I mean, General Musharraf had only come into power 2 years before that through a coup. So just like his predecessor, dictator Zia, how he served the U.S. interest during Cold War, fighting communism in Afghanistan, this time Musharraf saw an opportunity that by aligning with the U.S., he would be able to gain the international legitimacy, gain the international aid, and promote himself as the friend of the free world, and things will get better for him domestically, which they did for a long time before. Obviously, when things started to emerge, everything started to fall apart.
If I can just interject for a second,
Yep.
That's all very intriguing. It actually, just a thought, because it kind of brings together everything that your co-guests are saying. Zulfikar, you were talking about this rehabilitation program, religious rehabilitation program in Singapore, which is about bringing together, moving away from the legal aspect of it and telling people who they're meant to be in life. Kamran, you talk about CIA covert operations, the media and the government in bed together in Pakistan, trying to keep the public in the dark. And I suppose coming full circle, it brings us back to what you said, Asim, at the very beginning, which is that, the war on terror is essentially this global campaign to target the very essence of what it means to be a Muslim. My question to you, Dr. Asim, is, do you actually think that, I suppose historically, the last 20 years, but also today, if that's the scope of this global campaign, do people realize, as a leading member of an NGO, your role is to work to raise awareness. Do you feel people have woken up in these 20 years to the scale of this global campaign against the very essence of what it means to be a Muslim?
Yes and no. I mean, I think a lot of Muslims realize that there are grave problems that are going on in the Muslim world. One of the great saving graces of the Muslim Ummah is that it recognizes when parts of it are in trouble, and they do make dua. I've been in the most remote regions of the Muslim world, northeast Kenya, northwest Pakistan, just lots of different kind of remote areas. Met people, completely, under, who have low socioeconomic prospects in life, to put it bluntly. And their knowledge and the way that they connect with what is going on in the Muslim world is unbelievable. You would never, imagine that, when their daily concern is whether or not rain is going to fall from the sky, that they still have the concerns of what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Syria, very much at the top of their minds. They use qunut, and they use various forms of dua to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to assist these people. And that is a huge saving grace that we have in relation to the general masses of the Muslims around the world, whether they're men, women, or children. Right? Alhamdulillah, we have that connectivity. Saying that, we are so structurally disenfranchised because of how governance within the Muslim world works. and the way that geopolitics plays such a huge role in the way in which our states operate, that politically making the shift from something that you have in your heart to actual mobilization is much more difficult. And so people, a large part of the Muslim world, will resolve themselves to this kind of like make dua, do what I can, give charity, as kind of like the bare minimum of the way that they could possibly operate. And after that, it's just like, okay, you know, I've done what I can. Now I have to just do as much as get whatever I can out of this very, very problematic system that I live in. Yeah. But fundamentally, they know and understand the problems that are going on. Fundamentally, they know that they live in a time that is problematic, that they know that, kind of secularism, nationalism are key issues. They know that the war on terror exists. They know that Palestine is under assault. They know enough about kind of American hegemony around the world. They feel for the Uyghur in China. So we have all of these things, but because of how demobilized we are, it makes it much more difficult to then say, that awareness carries through at the level of action. But that's a problem with the way that governance works in the Muslim world, unfortunately, and that leadership filters down to the general masses.
And I guess that's as you rightly identify, that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And organizations such as yours, such as Cage, who do some really, really good work, mashallah, have been active in this space. And, I guess that's where we all need to ask those kinds of critical questions of ourselves as Muslims. Are we just going to sort of make that dua, take that sort of level one foundational approach and then sort of leave it in the hands of Allah? Or are we going to try and engage ourselves a little more forcefully and fruitfully, so to speak? Before moving on any further, I wanted to ask Brother Zulfikar, I sort of alluded to this before, but I wanted to ask you specifically about your imprisonment. So you were imprisoned for 4.5 years in Singapore on those charges that you mentioned related to, that's if they were even charges, those accusations related to your support for the resistance against Bashar al-Assad. Could you talk us through sort of what you experienced, how it occurred? It was from the Singaporean secret police as well, if we understand correctly.
In this is the first time I ever spoke about this.
No, subhanAllah.
In 2014, when all these things were going on, there was also an attack on Palestine by Israel. So a Singaporean man put up a Palestinian flag in front of his house, and he was told by the Singapore police that you're not allowed to put up the flag of another state in Singapore. So I checked the laws and said, yeah, that's true. So I said, why don't I put it on Facebook? Why don't we then put up the Shahada flag, because it's the flag of the Ummah, to show our solidarity with Palestine. They use that to accuse me of supporting ISIS.
Oh, goodness me.
This is not the ISIS flag. Not the ISIS flag. This is the normal Shahada flag, right? So that became the basis, and it was publicized all over Singapore and so on. So that became the basis of the 4 years and 4 months detention. But 90% of the discussions that I have in detention was, don't criticize the government. So the main thing that they were trying to get me to rehabilitate me.
Are these discussions that you had with government representatives, or who were these discussions?
Psychologists, the secret police officers. The main thing was, don't seek change, respect the status quo, don't question the government. In fact, in May last year, right a few months before I was released, the psychologist told me that he did not want me to be released earlier. And asked him why. He said, because I think you will still criticize the government. Now I feel confident that you will not. Right. So that was the basis. So what happens is that all this, it doesn't matter anymore what they need to prove, because you're a Muslim, and because they can in some way they can show that you support terror. that became the basis to silence you. And a lot of Muslims that I know, whether in Singapore or outside of Singapore, have silenced themselves because they are worried that they'll be implicated and they will get into trouble. So that was one of the biggest things that I see. And again, I think that referring to what Asim said earlier, I believe in the democratization of society, and that the society, we need to move, right? And that we need to activate the people. The problem that we have right now is a problem in terms of the leadership, and that the leadership is getting delegitimized. Because as long and as far as they keep on just parroting whatever that the government wants them to say and do, they are going to lose the respect, and they're going to lose the support of the common people. And I think that is happening more and more. And I think that as much or as long as they keep on doing that, they're going to lose support. And those of us, like for me, I'm not equipped to become a religious leader. I'm not a sheikh, right? I study politics. I study international relations. I was in my final year of international relations PhD. 2 months after I was detained, my university terminated my candidacy because of. They said that it's because of the letter received was because of the detention and the accusations. So my study is politics and international relations. I'm not a sheikh, so I don't have the qualifications to lead the community. But what's happening is the people like us who are now trying to work with the ground and the community that have been forced to accept part of that responsibility. And I think it's not right. I think that the Muslim community, the leaders, the shuyukh, the political leaders, they need to start to represent really what we have to say and what we feel, and to become our strength instead of accepting and internalizing the weakness.
Yeah, I think, Kamran, you alluded to that as well earlier about in Pakistani society as well, that there was the gap, as you can sort of mention, between the leadership and the people and the different thoughts that were going on. So I think that is emerging as sort of a trend throughout sort of the local policies that have been implemented towards communities in light of the war on terror. I wanted to also ask him just quickly, maybe not too much detail on this one, but you guys, with regards to leadership, in the UK you had the prevent policy. Now, we got sort of the leftovers and the breadcrumbs of prevent in Australia, and we got very similar policies implemented on our end as well. But can you talk us through sort of not just the way that prevent tried to entice Muslim leaders and community figures and so forth, but also the way that it would try and coerce and force leadership to comply, and the kind of impact that had on Muslim community leadership, but also on the average Muslim as well? Sure.
Yeah, it's a very difficult relationship that the Muslim community in the UK has had with prevent. Ostensibly, it was brought in to as a soft form of counterterrorism, to stop people from becoming terrorists in the future. But of course, this requires a crystal ball gazing exercise. But the key point about prevent really is that what they were effectively saying is that we want to identify who might be a threat in the future. But in order to do that, what you have to do is that you don't just look at traditional policing and see whether or not somebody is building a bomb, or if they're kind of like trying to accrue a cache of weapons. What they do instead is that they have to pathologize our behaviors and our beliefs in order to think that risk through. So all of a sudden, if you start wearing a hijab, or if you grow your beard, or if you start praying 5 times a day,
the conveyor belt idea.
Right. I mean, that's where it starts. This idea that there are step-by-step processes of so-called radicalization. And the problem with one of the key problems with that is that when you leave that in the hands of the public sector, so doctors, nurses, dentists, pharmacists, teachers, university lecturers, to play that role of identifying who is a potential future threat, you're not just doing it based off of a list. You're also bringing into the room the pervasiveness of racism that exists in society. So if your 2 most popular newspapers are are two of the most racist newspapers in the world.
Yep.
And, you know, your politicians have a racist discourse and the media has a racist discourse. And, you know, kind of criminal justice has a racist discourse around, you know, kind of people of color more generally, but Muslims in the context of the war on terror specifically. Then when they make assumptions about us in the public sector space, they are already prepped at the back of their minds to see us as potential threats. So all of a sudden expressing opinion about Palestine doesn't just become part of the conversation about activism for different causes in the UK. It becomes
an indicator.
Right, of dangerousness, of future dangerousness. And all of this is extremely unscientific, and the people who invented the science behind it say themselves that you can't use it to predict any kind of accuracy in relation to whether
I think you labeled it, or Cage perhaps labeled it pre-crime, the science of pre-crime. We didn't. Government, no. Well, I mean, we wrote that report, but the term pre-crime, which was popularized by Philip K. Dick, and, you know, and the movie version is called Minority Report, right? From his essay. It's the government that uses that themselves. When you speak to prevent officials, they talk about pre-criminal behavior. If you look at the so they actually adopt the terminology of pre-crime.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why it sounds dystopian.
Mind-blowing.
But they use it themselves, which makes the whole thing, you know, even more bizarre than it already is.
Sorry, if you could just narrow that down to the leadership question. So, carrot and stick, sort of coercing or pushing or tempting leadership to now play that role. And that can create tensions in Muslim communities.
One of the things that they did is that they removed all of the traditional funding sources for a lot of the primary services that Muslim community organizations give, whether it's alcohol, drugs, domestic violence, so on and so forth, right? Women's rights issues. And they said, if you want access to funding to do any of this work, we can make that funding available to you, and we can even give you even more. But you have to get it through this pot, which is prevent. And there's people like 𝒂𝒂 Qureshi, no relation, but he's an academic who's done some really brilliant work.
No relation to me either.
He's done some really brilliant work around this, where he actually shows how a lot of charities, you know, played that function. But generally, the Muslim leadership in particular, you know, they were being provided, you know, seemingly endless resources through prevent, but what they had to do was to sign up to it. So you end up in a situation where you want to get the access to the money, but you're also verifying that this thing is a legitimate tool at the same time. So unfortunately, we hamstrung ourselves by taking this money. Alhamdulillah, Cage, from the very beginning, you know, we recognized that this was something that we would never go anywhere near. And unfortunately, it's our youth that are paying the price for a very short-term vision that Muslim leadership in the UK had when this prevent funding was first made available. And, you know, I think we'll suffer the consequences of that still for many years to come.
Sufyan, you're on mute, by the way.
Just got a notification to that effect. Brother Kamran, I was just saying, if I can bring you in at this point, we heard a little bit about you based on your research on counterterrorism, what the Pakistani government did, and how it bent over backwards to American directives. We heard a little bit about, I suppose, your personal experience or what you know of the public in Pakistan. But you've lived for quite some time now in Australia as well. You spent considerable time here, and you're a member of the Muslim Legal Network, which obviously given you some scope to have mingled and interacted and networked with people in that field. As a Muslim, as a young Muslim living in Australia, having seen, okay, well, my country back home's bent over backwards, I've then now come to Australia. Your experience sort of dealing with that reality as a young Muslim in Australia, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the move to the West and being sort of awakened to the reality of counterterrorism as it is pursued in the Western government is obviously a little bit different than how it happens in the Muslim world. In the West, I guess. So I came here in 2004 initially, spent a couple of years in the school, then went back. But then since 2009, I've been here permanently. And over the years, you've seen that on a social level, the Western government have started started this attempt to sort of reform the Muslim community. They created this binary divide between the moderate and the fundamentalist Muslim. And I use the term fundamentalist as opposed to extremist because, as Brother Asim mentioned, that even the most fundamental things that a Muslim does, like, sisters wearing hijab or brother wearing having a beard or praying 5 times, they became symbol of the bad Muslim, so to speak. So there was a deliberate attempt, and it's still going on, to create a divide within the community between the moderate and the fundamentalist Muslim. But it's mainly really about how political the Muslim that particular individual is. It's got nothing to do with violence. It's got nothing to do with radicalization, so to speak. It's more to do with whether or not that person is political about Muslim issues and critical of the Western government's foreign policies or not. If they are, then they are more likely to be fundamentalist. If they are moderate or if they are or apolitical individual, they don't question the policies, they go about with the flow of the liberal Western values, then it's all fine and good. And the media obviously played a big part, a big role into this. They furthered this divide of moderate and fundamentalist Muslim through its reporting of terrorist incidents. And you see that happening even now. The way terrorist incidents are reported when the perpetrator is a white person, he's considered as someone who has pathological or psychological issues. Whereas with the Muslim, his inherent sort of nature of Muslimness is highlighted. And so that obviously led to the rise in Islamophobia, which we saw with our own eyes here in Australia and learned about overseas as well. And even commercial media like Hollywood became obsessed storytellers with the Islamophobic narratives and movies, made sure that even when the wars staged and perpetrated by the West are shown, depicted. At the same time, the individuals, the soldiers or the operatives are shown as people to have humanity in them. People like Fatima Bhutto have written a lot about this. So, and now we know that, straight after 9/11, there were meetings and collaborations between CIA and the Hollywood as to how to sell this narrative about war on terror. I guess that's been the type of influence that a young Muslim has faced over the years in the Western world.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kamran. Speaking of young Muslims, Zulfikar, I'll ask you this question. Now, lately, I don't know, maybe in the last couple of years, when I interact with young Muslims, I'm talking, say, sort of early university, late high school, things like that. And I'll mention things about September 11 or the war on terror, and they won't scratch their heads, but it just won't click to them, what this September 11 issue was. And they know that it was something that happened in the past, and the war on terror was something that happened. But it kind of almost seems like this new generation doesn't quite appreciate just how defining that war on terror was, or rather is, on an entire generation. Like, what could we say about keeping the lessons of the war on terror alive for a new generation that perhaps is not now living through that reality that we did? What can we do about that?
I just thought that was amusing that you asked about young people by asking the one who's not a young person.
Now, of course, you're young at heart. That's all that matters.
That's right. In the 1990s, right, I went to study in Hawaii, and on my flight there was this in-flight movie or documentary, and it was a documentary about this traveler in China, and it was a current documentary. So he had a guide, and this guy brought him all over China, and finally he was brought to Xinjiang, and the guide told him, when you go to this place, you don't have to worry about being cheated, because these people are Muslims and they will not cheat you. Right. So that was the environment that I was familiar with. That when you talk about Islam, you talk about people with honor, people with integrity, people who protect others. Islam is seen as good and beautiful. September 11th changed all that. When I was growing up, the evil empire was Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
Right? The Soviet Union was the evil empire, and everything that was bad. I hated the KGB when I was growing up. I thought the CIA were the good guys, and the KGB was this really evil group of people. But now we are like the KGB, and we are the Soviet Union. We are the evil nation, and that is not natural. It is an idea that has been created and perpetuated. My position is that, you know what, we can get back there. We can get back there not in relation to how others perceive us. We can get back there to how we perceive ourselves. Right? That we are trying to do good things. We are trying to bring this beautiful thing called Islam. We have been given this gift, the best gift that's ever been given, and this is something that we are supposed to help to bring to humanity, right? So this is something good, and we have to remember that the last 20 years is not natural. The last 20 years is not something that should define us and who we are. We define who we are, and we have to remember that we as Muslims, we bring the best thing that has ever been given to humanity. I think that is something that I would like to inculcate in my children and the young people. Be proud of who you are. You are Muslims, and that you have been given this wonderful thing, and it is your responsibility then to try to bring this to others, inshallah.
Inshallah. This is a question. It's open-ended. If anyone wants to take it, otherwise I'll nominate someone myself. 𝒁𝒊𝒂𝒓, you speak about Islam, obviously, and inculcating in the next generation the notion of Islam being a gift, the notion of Islam being a blessing. Obviously, that's not meant in a pacifistic way. Like there's been a war that's been waged, a campaign, and we take it as, Islam, show them the beauty of Islam. I suppose that's the basis upon which you wage your own campaign to counter theirs. Maybe just a comment from yourself on that firstly. Is that how you intended what you said?
Yeah. One of the things that I cannot be accused of is of being a pacifist. There's a lot of discussions, for example, in Muslim countries that I'm familiar with about being minority and how the majority may take action against you. The thing for me is that we defeat ourselves. We are so afraid of the supposed power of the others, right?
Yeah.
Because we refuse to act. The only reason why we are weak is because we refuse to use what we have, whether in Singapore or in Malaysia or anywhere else, because we refuse to act. And I think a lot of the problem is because we are too lazy to act. It's always someone else's problems. It's always someone else who, yes, brother, I will make dua for you. Yes, may Allah grant you one, because we do not want to do it. We don't want to take responsibility. And I think that if every one of us, if every Muslim says that, you know what, this society, this community is my responsibility, this world is my responsibility, I think inshallah there's a lot more that we can do. So, but the first thing is that we have to strengthen our belief in ourselves.
Of course.
We have to believe that we have that strength. We have to believe that we have that emotional and intellectual power to make changes. And once we believe that, then we can do it, inshallah.
And I suppose, those of us like yourselves who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, for a wisdom that He understands best, He's taken you through a certain set of experiences. He's taken Brother Dr. Asim through a certain set of experiences, and on the other side of those experiences came the activist in you. On the other side of Brother Kamran came the legal mind, or came the person who's got the insight to read the reality for what it is. I suppose there's a lot that we've been through, on the basis of which we can act. If our tech team can just put forward an image, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I've shared this with you guys before, just a little ideological spectrum of the Muslim community. And I think we might not be able to view it as guests, but just having a look at this ideological spectrum here, you have Muslims, various different types of Muslims in the community. And I'm looking at the different ways in which Muslims react to the war on terror, to campaigns that may be waged against Muslims, and then they question whether we can do something about it or not. There are those who will say that America is fighting the good fight. There are those who are saying, look, I'm totally sure there'll be people, I'm sure, listening to this podcast who might say, that's all well and good, but that problem that you're talking about is just somewhere else. Right now, I've got to think of my kids. I've got to think of my law degree. I've got to think of my, whatever else. And you've got an entire spectrum, as we've mentioned before the podcast itself. My question to you guys is, having a look at that spectrum, having a look at the range of that spectrum, especially at the middle, towards the middle section, where you've got various reasons being projected for why we can't step out, why we can't unfetter ourselves from the chains that hold us back. How would you address that various people within that spectrum with regards to how we can unfetter ourselves and try and be the best versions of ourselves in responding to the war on terror? Dr. Asim, if you can kick us off.
Nick, I think this is a difficult one because there's so much at play. There are so many different types of trauma that people are going through that we're not like with anything else, within a certain sociological context, to remove the individual from all of their environmental factors and to see them just in terms of a specific stance that they hold, a specific ideological trend that they're interested in or are adhering to, makes it very, very difficult to come up with very large conclusions about, where they are in that particular moment. And I think that's why, if you'll forgive me, I'm not sure how helpful these types of categorizations are, because ultimately we're complex human beings, right? Yeah. We make decisions based on personal experience, make decisions based on what we see going on in our family lives, in wider society. For those of us who have maybe slightly more years behind us, you'll notice a trend of what you were like maybe once when you were younger, what happens then when you get married, what happens then when you have children, what happens when you see potentially your children or your nephews and nieces or people in the community taking stances that at one point you would have been very, very hard on. All of a sudden, you're maybe a little bit more humane towards, right? There are all types of dynamics at play that should give us a sense of humility about where Muslims are. And that's why the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he categorizes the different levels of iman in terms of amal, right? It's very, very instructive for us, because hatred in the heart for an injustice or for a wrongdoing is not a passive act, as sometimes people present it as. It's still an active process. The Prophet didn't condemn the person who hates something in their heart as somebody who was necessarily blameworthy. Yes, there's a hierarchy that's being established here, or action. The best person is someone who removes a wrongdoing or an injustice with their hand. For sure, there's a hierarchy here. But the one who just hates it in their heart, the Prophet said, doesn't go on to say, and this person is in the hellfire. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒎, right? It's the opposite.
Of course. Right?
It's still being praised, this person. But maybe for them, their specific test just relates to them holding on to that bit of iman in their heart to the extent that they're able to say to themselves, I don't like what's going on in the world because I love Allah and because I love Muslims and because I hate oppression, right? Right? That's still an active process. And I think because what capitalism teaches us is that we have to be able to measure things at all times. Efficacy has to be measured by results, by empirical evidence that we have moved forward in X, Y, or Z way, right? Whereas we're not able to measure barakah, we're not able to measure iman, we're not able to measure certain things, right? Because, capitalism hasn't taught us to value these things in the same way. And so maybe I'm getting a bit softer as I get older, I don't know. But when I see these types of kind of categorizations.
Yeah.
I'm less interested in them only because I feel that, you know, people are struggling in lots and lots and lots of different environments, and they make sense of their relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a multitude of ways. And I think if we can find ways of acknowledging that, being humble towards it, then we have a better chance of understanding where we are. But I don't think any of these categories are hard. If they were, then we wouldn't have the dua, you know, of Ya muqallib al-qulub thabbit qulubina ala dinik, right? Like we wouldn't even say that, because otherwise what we're saying is that these are rigid lines that we can't cross. And I think at all times, in all circumstances, we can go across any of these lines, as we should, inshallah. So yeah, that's my take on that.
No worries, Jazakallah khair.
Sorry if it doesn't answer you directly.
That's okay. It's very insightful nonetheless. Brother 𝒁𝒂𝒂𝒓, your thoughts on what Dr. Asim was saying, or on my earlier question as well? I guess the question is also rigidity of those categorizations aside, and if we can perhaps, how would I say this, conceptualize it a little differently. If you look at some of those categorizations, essentially what it's saying is there are certain things, and I suppose we can do this in different ways, you know, like it doesn't have to be done in a way that's necessarily critical. You know, I know as I put the question to yourself, as someone who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed to be quite active in what you do, and this is to all three of you, you know, you wouldn't want to look at a categorization and say, these people are prioritizing their family and I will come out and criticize them. So of course the style has to be done, you know, the style itself has to be very thought out and whatever else. But at the end of the day, Dr. Asim or 𝒁𝒂𝒂𝒓 or Kamran yourself, you look at the statistics of what's happened. You look at the legacy that it's left on a mindset, the idea of a generation being hijacked. And then you see, you know, hundreds of thousands of Muslims who, for whatever reason, whatever journey they're going through, haven't gotten on board a program to actually partake, to respond even to a war on terror or a campaign of terror. How do you deal with that? Does that conflict, you know, how do you reconcile that conflict? 𝒁𝒂𝒂𝒓.
Like, should we be agitated by that kind of reality?
I think you're on mute, Brother 𝒁𝒂𝒂𝒓. Sorry.
Is that right?
Yep,
There we go.
I said some really beautiful stuff, so you guys just...
We missed it.
You're going to have to say it again, brother, please, for the benefit of our audience.
There's a couple of issues, I think, for me, right? One is that whatever role that you see for yourself, inshallah, as long as you're doing something and you believe in what you're doing, inshallah, there's barakah in that. Inshallah, that's the role that you're supposed to take. So your role may be organizing an NGO, like your brothers are doing, or your role may be to engage with the government. Your role may be to help, to go to prisons to help the Muslims. Your role may be as a teacher. So all of us have our roles, right? And as long as we play our roles as best as we can, this amanah that has been given to us, the responsibilities, the trust, the skills that Allah has given to us, as long as we make use of them in the best way that we can, inshallah, then the community will grow. In terms of, there are people who are not able to do anything at all but dua. And if they can do that, alhamdulillah. But make sure that you do.
Yep.
Right? Make sure that you do something. Now, there are also, like you said, hundreds of thousands or millions of Muslims who are not doing anything and who do not want to do anything. Then for me, the responsibility falls to the rest of us who are involved to help them to see and to help to activate them. So I was involved in marketing and sales, right? And you'll have when you try to promote your company's products, there'll be those who like it, those who do not like it, and so on. And for me, the way that I looked at it, because I was involved in Islamic finance, the way that I looked at it is you keep on trying to move everyone from one step to the next. There may be people who don't like you and speak against you actively. Then what I try to do is just stop them from speaking actively against us, right? By showing them what we are doing and so on. Now, there may be people who are in the middle, who are neutral, who refuse to get involved. Then what I try to do is just to get them to support. You don't have to do anything, just support. just agree and just make dua. After that, get them to advocate. So the final position for me is, once you support us, let's advocate for us or help us in some way. So that becomes my responsibility. And it's the responsibility of all of us who are active, who wants to see these communities to be strong, who wants to see this community to be active, to have agency, to recognize its own strength, to recognize its beauty, to try to activate those who are not doing anything. So, but the way that they do it is up to them, because they have their own strength. So recognize and respect what they do, and try to get those who are not doing anything to just take one step further, inshallah.
Inshallah. Brother Kamran, a question to you, if I may. Hamza's been quite, I suppose, praiseworthy of Cage's initiative. So I think he's looking to establish Cage Australia. Ask him just.
We'll talk later, Asim. We'll talk later.
But my question to you, Kamran, is you're part of a legal network. You're part of a network. Just coming from that angle, what scope do you see? What benefit do you see in that level of collaboration? How important do you think it is? As if we had, for example, an NGO, the kind that Asim runs or manages in the UK. If we had, activists and writers and researchers like yourself and Brother Zulfikar in one city, I want to see that level of collaboration. What benefit do you think that could bring about for us? Is that where the future is in terms of our war on terror, our war on the war on terror, if you will?
I think so. I think that's something which we need to strive towards here in Australia. I think if I'm not wrong, and if I can remember correctly, we've even had that discussion within our legal network, within MLN, as well, as to how to do advocacy. Because one of the things that we do is regularly speak on issues which affect the Muslim issues here in Australia, including counterterrorism laws and things like that. Obviously not at that scale, but we would like to see the Muslim activity going up to that scale. But I just want to go back to why it's very important, especially for the young minds here in Australia, young Muslims here in Australia. And Brother Asim gave reference of the hadith, which is very worthwhile for every Muslim to keep in mind and to keep reminding ourselves. In light of that, I guess whatever level of faith you're on and whatever you can, I guess, depending on your circumstances, achieve to do, what you should do is educate yourselves about what's happening. And once you start to educate, then you can advocate. And organizations like Cage obviously do both. They educate people and they advocate for what's wrong in the society. And it's important to educate the young minds about the Western contradictions in the context of what's happened over the last 20 years. I mean, if you look at even the media today over what's happened in the past 1 month in Afghanistan, we seem to be talking a lot about the takeover, the Taliban 1.0 versus Taliban 2.0, the future of women and minorities in Afghanistan. And these are all questions which are extremely important. But what's missing over here is the accountability of the West, right? The contradictions of the political violence of the West, the wars that the West have waged, which ultimately led to the revival of Taliban, and the fact that the West is primarily responsible for what's happened, not just in the past 1 month, but over the past 20 years. They literally went on a killing spree and left abruptly after 20 years, with people literally falling off planes. And even while leaving, the US managed to struck civilians by a drone strike and whatnot. So we need to push back against the idealism of Western liberal values, so that 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, we don't hear of another humanitarian interventionism happening to rescue, the deficit of democracy in the Muslim lands, for example. And even more on a political and ideological level, we need to be aware of the Western liberal values and that they're not universal as they are made out to be. So, for example, human rights is a concept which is adopted in the Western liberal discourse quite often, but we need to educate ourselves that even though it's espoused to be a universal framework, it was actually made by the Western powers, and the way it's deployed with the freedom of speech, being fine with ridiculing the religious texts and scriptures and sacred personalities, but at the same time cracking down on the state treason and things like that. The way the whole human rights framework is deployed ultimately reinforces those Western liberal values as opposed to some universal values. So I think an organization like Hijacking is extremely needed here in Australia to educate and advocate in that space.
Jazakallah khair, Kamran. Look, we are slightly running out of time now, and by slightly I mean effectively almost completely. So look, I guess my question would be twofold, and sort of it's open-ended as well. Has the war on terror ended, or does it continue in a more subdued, perhaps insidious form? What does it look like now? I know I'm asking something quite broad, but let's just try and keep it fairly narrow. But what does the war on terror look like now? Is it still going? Is it done and dusted? Do we move on from it? And the second part, I know it sounds like there was multiple parts to that, but the next is what lessons do we need to learn from these preceding 20 years to take into our forthcoming 20 years and thereafter, inshallah. And Dr. Asim, if you could perhaps start us off, and keeping in mind that we are running short. I know I asked a lot, but we're going to have to exercise the advice of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and few words with much meaning, inshallah.
Sure, inshallah. Look, for me, it's quite simple. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it usually is. So regardless of what you call the war on terror, if those policies continue, then we should continue calling it a war on terror, because we don't want to create a discontinuity with what happened post 9/11 in terms of the invasion of Afghanistan, all the policies that were brought in. We don't want them to be able to rebrand the oppression and repression that we face in all parts of the Muslim world and non-Muslim world, wherever we are, whether it's what's happening in UAE or Saudi Arabia. This is all part of the edifice of the global war on terror. So I think that's important, that we always look at policies and practices rather than looking at the specific narrative that they are trying to present us with. And by all accounts, we are still living through a global war on terror, very much so. And the second part, you were asking about,
lessons.
What lessons we can learn.
So maybe ultimately, I think number one takeaway.
Yeah, not to be short-termist in our ideas about how we respond, and for it not to be self-interested to the immediacy of our community's needs. I think we have to look at any kind of venture or policy as something, how does this look 50 years from now for Muslims living in either the country that we're in or, kind of globally. We live in a neoliberal world where, actions that we take in the West very much impact on, kind of Muslims elsewhere. And so we always have to be aware of both time and space and how these things intersect with one another in relation to the decisions that we make. So yeah, I guess that's it from me. Jazakallah khair.
Zulfikar, yourself?
In terms of the war on terror, if you look at the physical part of it, not as much as it used to be, but the ideas that allowed for it to happen and the ideas that justify a lot of other policies that are bound with the war on terror, I think that does not just exist. I think it has strengthened over time. So the ideas, the policies, and so on are much greater than it used to be. In terms of the lessons, for me, it is that we have allowed ourselves to be weak. As a community, as a society, we have allowed ourselves to be weak, and we have allowed ourselves to be de-linked from each other. We do not tap into each other's strength. We do not seek to work together. We do not seek to activate ourselves. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we have. And I think that, inshallah, is what we need to do, to strengthen ourselves, not just in one way. Strengthen our deen, those of us who can do it, strengthen our economy, strengthen our activism. I think in all these different ways, as Muslims, I think we need to move a bit more. Just take that extra step, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. And Kamran, you've got the last word.
I obviously agree with what the brothers have already said, so I'll try and add very little to that. I think the war on terror is very much alive. We might be past the phase of the Western kinetic action, so to speak, in the Muslim world, but there are the counterterrorism measures, the securitization, the surveillance of communities is all around the world is there. There's more powers in the shadows with the deep state as it used to be 20 years ago, even in countries like Australia, which says that it's a liberal society. It's adopted more counterterrorism laws than other Western countries. In the last 2 decades, about 92 counterterror laws were enacted within the country, which is more than other Western countries. And they include powers like preventative detention, stripping citizens, citizenship, secret trials, control orders for kids, as little as age 14. Things like that. And some of these laws have been used against not terror suspects, but people like journalists and whistleblowers and things like that. So the war on terror is there. It's very much alive. And I guess we need to be aware of where it's headed. It's the future of war on terror is less on the battlefield and more on the political and the legal field. The West is obviously giving more support for anti-Muslim blocs like the Israel and India in their oppression of Kashmir and Palestinian people, which is not directly part of the war on terror project, but they are linked because they are allies of West in the repression of the Muslim communities. So we need to educate ourselves and we need to advocate for that. And one last thing I would say is basically going back to how I started, is we need to be mindful of the secrecy which operates where these counterterrorism measures operate. And that secrecy has only been deployed in other contexts. In the past couple of years with COVID, we've seen governments taking a lot of initiatives and decisions behind closed doors with very little information being shared by public. In fact, I was reading today that the Australian government is actually pushing back releasing the vaccine agreement it signed with AstraZeneca because of national security reasons. So we need to be aware that
which is the same pretext under which the counterterrorism laws were first.
Exactly. So we need to be aware that other pretexts, other conditions, other circumstances will arise, which will further provide the opportunity for secrecy, and we need to push back against that. We need to educate and we need to advocate.
I think the lesson we've learned is that we can actually have a podcast alone with any one of you if we really wanted to take the true benefit of your thoughts. We really, really appreciate you coming on tonight. Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Zulfikar, Brother Kamran, and Dr. Asim. Very much appreciate your time tonight, your thoughts. And I suppose thank you all. We've had a lot of comments. It's very difficult. We have read a lot of those comments. It's very difficult to read those comments and not engage directly with them. I think if we have a shorter guest list, maybe one or two in future, we'll take a lot more comments on board. But it's been a fiery comment section. We'll see if we can respond to some of those comments after the podcast is over, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Hamza, if you want to add any final words yourself?
No, just thank you once again to all our speakers. It's been a fantastic, worthy discussion. It's critically important that we continue to have these discussions. All of the guests did mention things about educating ourselves, learning, being aware. This is one humble effort amongst many to just contribute to that. So I guess for those still watching or listening and who've endured the entirety of the length of this podcast so far, like, subscribe, keep listening. We're going to try and pump out more content that is relevant, informative, and useful for our community, inshallah. But thank you very much. A truly international cast here as well. Jazakallah khair. Thank you all for being here, and we can leave it at that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.